When you think about the fall of history's greatest powers, your mind usually goes to, some huge external force.
Right, a massive invasion, a rival superpower breathing down their neck.
Exactly. You picture a Mongol horde or something equally dramatic. But what happens when an empire that is, for all intents and purposes, militarily untouchable, economically dominant, what happens when it just dissolves? I mean, how does an entity as enormous as the Umayyad Caliphate, which once controlled territory from Spain all the way to India, how does that just vanish in the Abbasid revolution of 750 CE?
It's a shocking speed.
It is. And then you jump to the other end of the timeline and you see a modern nuclear superpower, the Soviet Union, capable of projecting power across the entire globe, and it just dissolves in 1991. And crucially, without a single major external military defeat.
Yeah, the standard historical answers, they always feel a bit incomplete, don't they? They focus on those external pressures.
They really do.
And that's really the foundation of our deep dive today. That realization that the external factors, they're often just the catalyst. The real problem is an already terminal internal rot.
So it's already sick on the inside.
Precisely. We've analyzed your sources, and they tell this single, consistent, and frankly urgent story that spans 12 centuries. If you pull out the core principle that unites the Abbasid Revolution, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the judicial crisis in Pakistan in 2007, it's this. Systemic collapse is a constitutional and moral failure first.
And only a military or economic failure second.
Exactly. The sources use this really powerful metaphor. They say the downfall of a great state happens gradually in the hearts of the people and then falls all at once.
That phrase, it begins in the hearts. That feels like our blueprint for today. It suggests that, state legitimacy isn't really maintained by armies or by how much gold is in the treasury.
No, it's maintained by justice, by fidelity to the founding principles.
So our mission today is to connect these three incredibly different historical moments. We have a foundational Islamic caliphate, a 20th century communist superpower, and a modern South Asian democracy. And we're going to try to demonstrate this one singular truth about the link between equality, justice, and, state stability.
Exactly. We're looking for the shared architectural flaw. When the state becomes fundamentally disconnected from its social contract, that implicit promise that it serves and protects all its citizens justly, it just creates this volatile vacuum.
So we're looking at historical blueprints for what happens next.
We are. And the core question for you, our listener, is this. What does this pattern tell us about what a state needs to be seen as legitimate, even today? So let's unpack this. And I think we have to start with the most dramatic and certainly the most foundational case study, the Abbasid Revolution.
Okay, let's do it. Let's jump straight into 750 CE and the Umayyad Caliphate. Before we get into the collapse, can you just set the scene for listeners who might not be specialists in this era? I mean, describe the sheer scale of the power we're talking about here.
We are talking about the dominant world force of its time. It was an empire of just staggering scope.
Built on those early conquests in the 7th century.
Right, and it stretched from Spain all the way across North Africa, through the entire Middle East, and then deep into Central Asia. They were sophisticated, they were centralized, and they had a vast professional army.
Which is why the sources are so insistent on this point.
Exactly. This empire did not fall because of an external military defeat.
Yeah.
It was not conquered by another power. It imploded.
An implosion of that magnitude, I mean, that suggests a really deep systemic sickness. The sources call this the first major Islamic example of a social contract breakdown. But what does that actually mean? In practice, back in the 8th century.
It means that while the caliphate still had all the external trappings of power, the tax collectors, the governors, the army commanders, it had lost the moral mandate to rule in the eyes of the people.
The consent of the governed, so to speak.
Precisely. The original Islamic state, the one founded by the Prophet and the early caliphs, was built on these universal principles of equality, of justice, or adl, and consultation, shura. But the Umayyads, they converted the caliphate into a hereditary Arab monarchy.
Centered in Damascus.
It's centered in Damascus.
Yeah.
And in doing so, they systematically violated those founding principles. The system wasn't running on consent born from shared values anymore. It was running on pure coercion.
Okay, and the sources you provided, they detail 6 specific internal factors that really push this decline into a terminal state. We can almost think of this as a checklist for how an empire commits political suicide. Let's walk through them.
The first two are deeply connected: constitutional injustice and social inequality. The Umayyads just failed to live up to that constitutional promise inherent in the Islamic founding texts, the idea that the laws of God apply equally to all.
But they didn't.
No. Instead, they built a system of ethnic privilege. This wasn't just, bad politics. It was a fundamental perversion of the state's entire raison d'etre, its reason for being.
And that leads right into your third and fourth points. The oppression of marginalized groups, and as a result, the erosion of trust in the leadership.
It has to. When the rules are so clearly rigged to favor one group, trust just evaporates. It doesn't matter how efficient your bureaucracy is at that point.
Right.
And the fifth factor, the violation of principles like equality and shura, it basically codified this failure. Shura, or consultation, was meant to ensure that the leadership, while powerful, wasn't arbitrary, that the community had some input.
But by establishing a hereditary dynasty.
By establishing a hereditary dynasty, the Umayyads symbolically and practically threw that principle out the window. They decided they no longer needed to consult or be accountable. And that is always the beginning of the end for any system that's founded on shared values.
Okay, so that brings us to the sixth factor, which is maybe the most specific but also the most critical driver of the actual revolution. The devastating alienation of non-Arab Muslims. They were known as the mawālī. I want to spend some real time here because this is where that abstract idea of constitutional failure becomes a lived, daily, grinding reality for millions of people.
This is the critical mechanism of collapse. The mawālī, we're talking about Persian, Turkic, Coptic, Berber converts to Islam, they were absolutely foundational to the Umayyad economy and its culture.
But they were treated as second-class citizens.
Fundamentally second class. And their injustice wasn't just, a passive thing. It was institutionalized. It was written into the system.
How did that institutional injustice actually show up in their daily lives?
Well, we can point to three main avenues of discrimination, and it really starts with economics.
Okay, so money, taxes.
Exactly. Despite being Muslims, they were often forced to pay higher taxes. Specifically, they were sometimes made to pay the jizya.
Wait, the jizya. But wasn't that the poll tax specifically for non-Muslims living under Muslim rule?
It was. And that's the core of the insult, you see. It was a direct economic drain, sure, but it was also a profoundly demoralizing message. It signaled that their conversion, their identity as Muslims, wasn't accepted as truly equal citizenship.
So they're providing the tax base, they're providing the administrative skills that the empire needs to run.
Absolutely.
But they're receiving blatantly unequal treatment in return. That is just political self-sabotage.
It is. And the political dimension only reinforces this. They were routinely excluded from key government offices, from military leadership roles, the deep ones. Their political participation was so severely limited that they had no institutional channel to address their economic grievances.
They were the essential professional class, but they had no seat at the table.
None at all. But the true moral and constitutional disaster, the thing that really proved the system was fundamentally broken beyond any hope of repair, was the inequality in the courts. That is the ultimate loss of legitimacy. The sources detail instances where the testimony of a non-Arab Muslim, a mullah, held less weight in court than that of an Arab Muslim.
So if you can't get equal treatment before the law.
If the state's highest guarantee, the promise to dispense impartial justice, is ethnically biased, then the state is no longer a constitutional entity. It's just an extractive, discriminatory machine. And this was a clear, direct violation of the moral foundation of the caliphate itself.
And this is where we have to go back to that foundational text, because the source material explicitly quotes the prophet's command that was being violated every single day.
Yes, the famous line from the farewell sermon.
No Arab has superiority over a non-Arab except by piety. The Umayyads were actively governing on the exact opposite principle.
Precisely. They created a moral contradiction that just became impossible to sustain. The Constitution promised equality based on piety. The state delivered privilege based on ethnicity. And this gave the Abbasid movement a moral high ground that just transcended any regional disputes.
They could legitimately claim they were fighting for a restoration.
They could, and they did. A restoration of true Islamic principles for justice and equality for all believers.
So this systematic alienation created the perfect conditions for a revolution. All those grievances just became dry tinder waiting for a spark. And when Abu Muslim al-Khurasani began his mobilization in the eastern province of Khorasan, he didn't have to invent some new revolutionary ideology. He just had to promise to enforce the state's own ignored principles.
He was a brilliant organizer, there's no doubt about that. But his success rested entirely on that pre-existing widespread alienation. He was able to unite these disparate and often competing groups. You had disaffected Iraqi tribes, various religious and political dissidents, and most crucially, the massive, wealthy, and deeply resentful population of the mawālī across Persia and Khorasan.
And they all unified under the black banners of the Abbasids.
They did.
So in a way, the Umayyad state did the revolutionaries' work for them. They created this vast, unified constituency that was just ready for radical change, all by denying them basic constitutional justice.
That is the essential takeaway from this first part of our analysis. The revolution succeeded with just astonishing speed because the central authority had no reservoir of legitimacy left. The moment the Abbasids offered a credible alternative, one based on a return to that foundational social contract of equality and justice.
And specifically addressing the plight of the mawālī.
Critically, the mighty Umayyad military machine and its administration, they just evaporated. It was a collapse of moral authority that then led to a political and military downfall. It was the ultimate proof of the state's fatal disconnection from its own people.
That's a staggering realization. One of the greatest empires in history brought down primarily by internal moral failure and really a tax dispute affecting marginalized citizens.
When you boil it down, yes.
Okay, so let's take that principle, the internal collapse of legitimacy because of inequality, and let's jump 12 centuries forward. We're moving from a state founded on divine law and universal piety to a massive, secular, authoritarian empire founded on historical materialism and class struggle. The Soviet Union.
The philosophical differences are obviously immense, but the mechanism of decay, as you said, is terrifyingly similar. This is where the comparative analysis gets really deep.
How could a state that was designed, in theory, to eliminate class and ethnic exploitation, how could it replicate the exact same constitutional failure as an 8th century caliphate?
That's the challenge, isn't it?
It is. The USSR did not fall because of a massive military invasion. We know that. It was an internal systemic failure. So let's detail that internal rot. The Soviet Constitution, for instance, guaranteed extensive rights on paper.
Oh, on paper it looked great. Freedom of speech, press, assembly.
But the political reality was the complete opposite.
The Soviet Constitution effectively became meaningless. And this is a slight but important difference from the Umayyads, who at least had a founding moral document they were selectively ignoring. In the Soviet Union, the Communist Party established its rule as inherently superior to the law.
So the law served the party, not the other way around.
Exactly. The rule of law was replaced by the arbitrary political will of the party, the Politburo, the Central Committee. This is constitutional failure at its most fundamental level.
And the judiciary, which is supposed to be an independent branch.
It was entirely co-opted. Absolutely. The judiciary lacked any semblance of independence. It was just a rubber stamp for party directives.
And political dissent was criminalized?
Often under these incredibly vague statutes like anti-Soviet agitation. So when citizens realized the courts weren't impartial protectors of their rights, but were actually instruments of state suppression, the state lost all moral claim to authority. And then, on a societal level, to maintain this fiction, you have to systematically replace truth with propaganda, which just further erodes all the intellectual and moral foundations.
Okay, now let's draw the parallel explicitly. The Umayyad system alienated the mawālī, this wealthy, educated, populist group, by denying them equal status within the Islamic framework. Who played that role in the USSR?
The comparison holds up chillingly well. You really have two key groups. First, you have the marginalized nationalities and ethnic groups across the various republics.
Okay.
And second, and maybe a bit more subtly, you have the vast majority of the population who were excluded from the privileged class known as the nomenklatura.
Let's start with the ethnic comparison. How did the USSR marginalize its non-Russian citizens in a way that mirrors the status of the mawālī?
Well, despite the Soviet ideology promising ethnic self-determination and, socialist equality, the reality was this deep-seated centralization and exploitation by the Russian core.
A kind of internal colonialism.
That's a very good way to put it.
Yeah.
Non-Russian minorities consistently felt that their republics were being treated as colonial dependencies. They were sources of raw materials and labor, but they were denied any true political and economic autonomy.
And the sources specifically call out the 3 regions that were key to the final disintegration: the Baltics, the Caucasus, and Ukraine.
Yes. These peripheral regions, and particularly the Baltics, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, they harbored decades of suppressed nationalism and deep resentment against central control from Moscow.
So their push for independence wasn't just about culture.
No, not at all. It was a constitutional demand. It was the demand for the self-determination that the Soviet foundational documents promised them, but never actually delivered. This perfectly mirrors the Umayyad Center losing control of Khorasan because that bond of shared justice had been completely severed.
The periphery just saw the center as purely extractive.
Purely extractive. And what about the other group? The internal inequality, the analog to the Umayyad Arab elite.
Right, the nomenclatura.
That was the Soviet elite. We're talking about the top party officials, the government bureaucrats, the industrial managers. And while they were ideologically committed, on paper, to a classless society, they created a new hyper-privileged class.
With special privileges.
Oh, absolutely. They had access to special stores with Western goods, better housing, better health care, better educational opportunities for their children. All of it operating completely outside the grim economic realities that the average Soviet citizen faced every day.
So the state was functionally contradicting its own constitutional and ideological promise on two fronts. Externally, it's exploiting its ethnic republics, and internally, it's creating this new, officially denied economic aristocracy.
Exactly. And that is the heart of what the sources call the modern blueprint of constitutional meaninglessness. When your constitution guarantees class equality and ethnic brotherhood, but your political system relies on class privilege and ethnic subordination, the system loses its ability to generate internal loyalty.
It's just hypocrisy on a massive scale.
It is. And that increased inequality led directly to the disappearance of public trust, which then eroded the authoritarian structure from the inside out.
It's astonishing. You have these two immense empires separated by 1,200 years, and they both fail because they confused power with legitimacy.
That's a great way to phrase it.
They thought they could violate the moral and constitutional promise to their people and still command loyalty just through coercion, through force.
And that coercive system, it only works until the moment people collectively decide they no longer believe in it. The declarations of independence by the republics in 1991, they weren't acts of military conquest.
No.
They were the collective constitutional symptoms of a prior moral death. The center in Moscow could no longer enforce its will because that implicit social contract, the agreement that the state serves and protects its citizens justly, was irrevocably broken. The USSR, just like the Umayyads, had ceased to be a constitutional state, and it just became an extractive, discriminatory operation.
So we've looked at two examples of total state collapse, both stemming from this constitutional and moral rot. Now let's pivot to a really crucial counterpoint. A modern case where the exact same forces of injustice were at play, but instead of leading to disintegration, they forced a constitutional restoration.
Yes.
This is Pakistan's 2007 judicial crisis.
And this case is so vital because it proves the rule. The crisis demonstrates the power of constitutional principle when the people choose to fight for the integrity of their system, rather than just accepting its demise. The sources are right to call this a constitutional earthquake.
Okay, let's set the scene. Pakistan in 2007 is under the military rule of General Pervez Musharraf. What was the specific action he took that initiated this crisis and exposed that fundamental institutional decay?
The action was a direct, and I mean a brazen, assault on the separation of powers. Musharraf, using his executive authority, attempted to illegally dismiss the Chief Justice of Pakistan, Iftikhar Mohammad Chaudhry.
And he did this through something called an illegal presidential reference.
He did.
Can you explain that for us? What is a presidential reference and what made this particular one illegal?
Sure. A presidential reference is a mechanism that's designed to investigate the conduct of a high judge. But it's supposed to be conducted impartially. This one was illegal because it was so widely seen and later proven to be politically motivated.
So it wasn't about judicial integrity.
Not at all. It was about forcing the Chief Justice to step down so the general could appoint a more pliable replacement, someone who would validate his continued military rule and his constitutional amendments. It was a bold attempt by the executive to control the highest court in the land.
Which is a subversion of the core principle of judicial independence.
The absolute core. This action directly threatened the rule of law. This wasn't just, an administrative firing. It sent a signal that even the highest judge in the land could not expect equality or protection before the law if the executive decided they were inconvenient.
And the public response to that signal was immediate.
Immediate and massive. This wasn't a military coup. People saw it as a constitutional coup, and it triggered this full-scale, sustained civil resistance that became known as the lawyers' movement.
Let's break down the components of that resistance. How did they actually mobilize the demand for justice on the streets?
The mobilization was incredibly sophisticated. First, you had the core legal community. Thousands and thousands of lawyers, identifiable by their black suits and robes, they took to the streets nationwide. And that imagery was just so
The
powerful,
very symbol of the law.
marching against the lawlessness of the state. Exactly. They organized nationwide protests, these long marches that went from city to city.
And it wasn't just the legal community, was it? Who else joined in?
No, this movement successfully brought in civil society, the media, and all the opposition political parties. And you saw what the sources call a powerful media revolution. Independent news channels provided sustained 247 coverage, defying state pressure and ensuring the narrative wasn't hijacked by military propaganda.
And that collective effort.
That collective effort, which was fueled by this very clear demand for the constitutional restoration of the Chief Justice, it led to the definitive collapse of the military's legitimacy, both in the eyes of the public and the international community.
So this crisis revealed institutional decay, but, and this feels like the key difference, unlike with the Umayyads or the USSR, the institutions themselves, especially the legal framework, they didn't totally collapse. They were just sort of dormant.
That's the crucial distinction. The crisis exposed that the rule of law was weakened, that the judiciary was under immense pressure, and that the Constitution had been violated. But the core difference is that the people still had faith in the idea of the Constitution and its promise of justice, even if the current rulers had broken it.
So they felt excluded from power.
They felt excluded from power, and as a result, the existing institutions under Musharraf had lost all moral authority.
And that feeling of exclusion, that loss of moral authority, that's the common denominator, isn't it? It runs across all three centuries we've talked about. The same forces that broke the Caliphate and the Soviet Union were at work here.
Absolutely. We are drawing a direct line right back to 750 CE. Public trust in the ruling system collapsed in Pakistan, just as it collapsed for the Umayyads. People saw the executive acting above the law, creating an inequality where the law applied differently to the powerful than it did to everybody else.
And the demand was simple.
It was incredibly simple. Restore justice, equality, and accountability.
But the crucial difference, as you pointed out, is the ultimate goal of the movement. The Abbasids sought to completely dismantle and replace the Umayyad order.
Right, tear it all down.
But the Pakistani lawyers' movement, they sought the restoration and the revival of justice within the existing constitutional framework. They were demanding that the state adhere to its own promised principles.
Yeah, this distinction is why Pakistan serves as such a powerful model of resilience.
Right.
The sheer volume and the moral weight of the protest forced the executive's hand. The movement forced the reinstatement of the Chief Justice, it forced the resignation of the military ruler, and it led to fundamental constitutional amendments that actually bolstered judicial independence for the future.
And the outcome was hailed as the constitutional turning point of modern Pakistan. It demonstrates that when a state violates its social contract, the people's demand for justice can not only tear a system down like the Umayyads or the USSR, but if it's mobilized around the rule of law, it can also force the state to repair itself and adhere to its own constitution. It really proves that the demand for equality is the most potent political force that citizens have.
It does.
So we've now examined three profoundly different events: a medieval revolution, a modern superpower dissolution, and a contemporary constitutional struggle. I mean, the sheer separation in time, culture, ideology is just vast.
Yeah.
So how do we move from these compelling individual anecdotes to a truly universal, definitive principle?
We synthesize them. We use the comparative framework that the sources provide. We have to move beyond the differences. The Caliphate's focus on piety, the USSR is on class, Pakistan's on judicial independence, and look for the identical failure mechanism that's running underneath all of them.
Okay, let's walk through that point-by-point comparison. And let's focus specifically on how inequality and the resulting constitutional violation acted as the engine of collapse or crisis in each case.
For the Abbasid revolution, the core issue was explicitly social and ethnic inequality. It was the structural disadvantage placed upon the mawālī versus the Arab elite.
And the violation.
The violation was a breach of the foundational social contract of universal Islamic equality. The result, total system collapse and replacement.
Okay, now for the Soviet Union.
For the Soviet Union, the inequality was primarily ethnic and regional between the Russian center and the peripheral republics, and also that internal class inequality fostered by the nomenklatura.
And the violation there was the systematic meaninglessness of the Constitution itself.
Right. It was replaced by the arbitrary rule of the party, and the result, of course, was state disintegration.
And finally, Pakistan's 2007 judicial crisis.
The inequality here was systemic. It was executive power placing itself above the law, which forced an inequality before the judiciary. The violation was a direct breach of the constitutional contract, that requires judicial independence.
And the result was the collapse of the executive authority and the restoration and revival of the constitutional order.
Exactly.
The common thread running through all three, despite all the superficial differences, is just unmistakable. It's the foundational violation of the guarantee of equal protection and justice.
Absolutely. In all three cases, the government established a distinction between classes of citizens or inhabitants, whether you define that by ethnicity, legal status, or regional identity. The power structure decided that some groups were more equal than others,
And that systemic injustice immediately led to a loss of legitimacy.
which inevitably targeted the central authority itself.
But this raises a really crucial and challenging question. I mean, a modern state or even an 8th century empire might argue that, okay, injustice to a minority group is regrettable, but it's manageable, it's contained. Why does history prove again and again that injustice to any group becomes a threat to the entire state? How does that localized poison spread systemically?
It spreads because constitutional contracts are indivisible. The moment a state demonstrates that it's willing to violate the fundamental compact for one group, say, denying equal taxes to the mawālī or denying due process to the Chief Justice, it signals to all citizens that the Constitution is conditional. It's not guaranteed.
So if the system can be bent for the powerful or against the marginalized?
Then no one, eventually, is safe. That localized injustice becomes a universal threat perception.
That insight leads us directly to the core philosophical and legal conclusion from all of this, what the sources call the ratio decidendi.
Yes.
This is the foundational principle that explains why all these profoundly different events ultimately produced the same structural result.
And the ratio decidendi is clear. It's universally applicable, and it's deeply moral. It states, a constitution survives only while it protects everyone equally. Injustice to any group becomes a threat to the entire state.
Wow.
When the state fails to administer impartial justice, it forfeits its right to rule, and that's regardless of its military strength.
That is a staggering truth that just transcends political ideology. It doesn't matter if you adhere to the divine law of the Umayyads or the historical materialism of the Soviets. The political health of your state is dependent on the equitable distribution of justice.
Injustice is not localized damage. It's a systemic poison.
Deny rights to the mawālī, deny self-determination to the Baltics, deny due process to the Chief Justice. You are weakening the entire protective sheath of the state for everyone.
And the consequences are vast, and they are undeniable. The Umayyad collapse reshaped Islamic political history forever. It created a new dynastic and theological order. The Soviet collapse fundamentally reshaped global geopolitics. Ended the Cold War, created dozens of new nations.
And the Pakistan movement, while it was a restoration, it profoundly reshaped modern constitutional law by reviving judicial independence against this entrenched military authority.
They are all vastly different impacts, but they all teach the same universal truth. The stability and the legitimacy of the state are directly proportional to the impartial justice it administers.
History, in these three cases, is effectively whispering the same warning across more than 1,000 years: neglect justice at your peril. This deep dive leaves us with a really powerful moral and structural lesson. Justice, as the sources define it, it's not some political garnish you add on at the end. It's the fundamental infrastructure. The sources call it the oxygen of constitutional life.
The analogy of oxygen is perfect. A state can survive many shocks, military losses, temporary economic downturns, political scandals, but it cannot survive asphyxiation.
And injustice is asphyxiation.
It is. A society that structurally denies equality to some group, whether it's based on ethnicity or class or legal status, will inevitably lose stability for all. The marginalized group that the state oppresses today becomes the core constituency for state failure tomorrow.
If you needed a historical blueprint for state failure, this is it. But the ultimate cyclical lesson that these sources reveal is really twofold, isn't it? When justice collapses, nations collapse.
But conversely,
The example of Pakistan shows that when justice is fiercely demanded, nations can rise again. They can be forced to have fidelity to their own founding principles. The battle for state stability is always at its core a battle for equality.
and that leads to our final provocative thought for you, the listener. Based on this definitive historical evidence we've laid out, we've analyzed the blueprints of internal failure, systemic inequality, the institutional denial of justice to marginalized groups, and the loss of institutional moral authority.
So the question is,
Look at your own society today. Which groups, whether they're ethnic, economic, or legal, are facing similar documented inequalities? History suggests that the injustice faced by those groups today is not just a localized social problem. It is a severe, long-term threat to the constitutional survival and stability of the entire state structure. The health of the whole depends on the justice afforded to the least.
A sobering but very necessary thought to consider in the context of history's great failures and near failures. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the constitutional cost of injustice revealed by your sources.
Our pleasure.
We hope this analysis provides you with a crucial perspective on what truly keeps nations whole.